And so she thinks it's kind of politically naive. That's a term that she uses in the Fuller chapter. And she suggests that it fails to challenge the systems of domination to which feminism as a political movement arose to respond, right? It becomes sort of too easy in a way and ineffectual. That's her worry, that's her claim. And this kind of should recall a certain aspect of Carol Hayes' position in the chapter we looked at last time. You know, Hayes says, look, for the most part, feminists aren't focusing the bulk of their criticism on individual women's choices. But to make it all about individual women's choices takes attention away from the constraints in which those choices are unfolding, right? What options do you have to choose between? What are the costs in choosing one rather than the other? What incentives and disincentives are at work? What forms of power are kind of affecting people's decision making? So Hay really thinks we're at risk of losing focus on the constraints, right, and the work that those are doing. You know, and the possibility that certain constraints within which people make their choices are unjust. So I think Hay and Hooks are kind of, in a sense, singing the same tune there. So I'm saying something like that. Is that making sense so far? Okay, good. So yeah, so in sum, if anything goes, how can we develop meaningful critiques of unjust social systems rather than kind of leaving everything just more or less as it is? All right, now, Hooks goes on in this piece, and again, this comes out more clearly in the Fuller chapter, to say, look, if you really press people to come up with the definition of feminism, I'm surprised that this didn't seem to emerge yet. Maybe it did in your groups and I just didn't hear about it. But she says, if you press people to come up with a definition of feminism, like to commit to one, this is what most people, she thinks, in the United States would say. And again, this is a few decades ago, so it's possible that this has waned in its, you know, maybe it's not quite so ubiquitous now. But she says, look, if pressed, most Americans would define feminism as a movement that aims to make women the social equals of men. What do you think? I guess I'll ask you two questions. One is just kind of taking the social pulse, and then the other is more evaluative. Is this a definition that you think still has currency? Is this something that you think would be a kind of popular way of understanding feminism? Maybe just raise your hand if yes. Highly scientific polling method. Okay, but now, so let's discuss it. Because Hooks spends a lot of her chapter kind of critiquing it. But let's talk about it first a little bit. Like, do you think this is a satisfactory definition? And maybe what do you think its strengths are? And what do you think its weaknesses are? Either one. Yeah, Matthew.
I would say in today's society, question around what does it mean? More social construct. So it's like,
yeah,
the original idea was to make people equal to men, but now it's like, I think now it's just like trying to recognize how a system is fix that. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So if gender itself is to some degree a social, or in some sense a social construct, then it might indeed seem like the deeper question is like, what makes people women or men, and what do we think about that, right? And the piece from Simone de Beauvoir that we're looking at next time is one of the kind of foundational pieces in terms of thinking about gender as a social construct. So that's a good point. If we just focus on equality between two sort of social groups that we're kind of assuming we understand, right? We might miss this whole kind of deeper level of analysis. Yeah, that's a really good point. Any other thoughts about it? Yeah, Charlie.
I mean, I feel like one critique I've heard of making this kind of definition is that like the whole aim is to just make women the equals of men. You're kind of like working within, I guess, like the male paradigm, and you're sort of like equating the value of women to just like being like men. I guess is like a critique I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that could be why it could
Right.
be unsatisfactory. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive as well. So why is the standard masculine to begin with such that the aims of this movement should be construed as making women like that? I mean, again, there are complicated questions about what equality involves, but some notion of likeness probably plays a role in most people's kind of common sense thinking about it, right? So it's like, hey, we're already taking this one thing as the standard, right? Maybe we should question that. Actually, I mean, this is very convenient for me because both of these comments kind of anticipate our piece for next time. Good. Matthew, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, it reminds me of like when people, like when someone gets accused of being racist, like, oh, I don't see color.
Yeah.
You should recognize the fact that different people require different things from the system.
Okay, good. Right. So it might be kind of oversimplifying what would be required for justice, right? Just equal treatment might not always do the trick, so to speak. Good. So yeah, these are both or all really good points. Did you have your hand up too? And your name?
AJ.
AJ.
I would say that it may also just like lacking sort of weakness that I think that's kind of why Hooks sort of strays away from this. I mean I kind of like the Hooks definition of like ending sexism. That feels like much more like concrete. There's like it's like almost like a sort of quantitative because that's very like that's sort of like social equals is a very like qualitative goal. Whereas like ending sexism seems a lot more there's like a weightiness.
Right, there's a kind of definite goal there. If we can spell out at least what sexism is and so on and so forth. But good. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to pin down what this aim actually involves, as I think Hooks really spells out. And your name?
So two things. I'm troubled by the social equals of men because that's not the only issue. It's not just social,
True.
it's legal, it's things like that.
Yeah.
But also I think the sexism thing, fighting against sexism is a better definition, mainly because the patriarchy not only disadvantages women, but it hurts men as well. So I don't know, I think it's just not. Right.
Yeah, and she uses, so this is a quote from Hooks. I mean, this is an ideal that she's critical of, but she uses the term social. But I mean, a lot of people, I think, would just say equals and kind of leave it like really open. But we could be talking about political equals or economic equals or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, good. But right, I think your point that, how did you put your point about how patriarchy also harms men? That was kind of the central gist of the point, right?
For women, it's very obvious how it affects women, but with men, like toxic masculinity, believing that they can't cry, believing that they can't seek out comfort, like from a woman or something like that. They can't show weakness, and that harms them as well.
Yeah, so it imposes constraints and disadvantages on men as well. And you know, this is, I think, getting close to, well, there's a kind of general point that Hooks wants to make about the way in which certain versions of feminism can seem to be very targeted at men. And like one reason she really prefers defining feminism as a movement to end sexist oppression is that it doesn't center men, it centers sexism. It just says, look, anyone can, you know, the question is whether actions and policies and institutions and so forth are sexist in nature. And women may be sexist or perpetuate sexist norms as much as anyone, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, she thinks it's really important to recenter it from men in particular to sexism. aspect as being the problem. And then the other thing about men is, well, she says, if the aim is to make women the social equals of men, she thinks that this definition of feminism is going to be most appealing from a very particular perspective, like to women who, the men in their sort of social group are, you know, relatively affluent and have a lot of freedom and power and so on and so forth. But Hooke says, look, men are not all the social equals of one another, right? So if you think that feminism is centrally aimed at making women the social equals of men, well, you kind of have to ask, like, which men are you talking about? But she says, not all men are social equals, nor do all women share a common social status, right? And if you look at the first chapter of feminist theory from margin to center, in that chapter, she takes up the concept of oppression, and she argues, in effect, that women do not all share an experience of oppression. Women aren't all oppressed in the same way or to the same degree. And some women, in her view, are not oppressed at all. That doesn't mean that they don't face certain disadvantages in virtue of their gender, but oppression is a concept that should be reserved for, I mean, it shouldn't be used lightly, I guess, is her view, and she thinks many sort of affluent white women have a lot of social power and don't really count as oppressed. So again, if you want to look into those arguments more deeply, the first chapter of that book is also available to you. But so first of all, there are many men who are subject to exploitation and oppression along various lines: class, race, sexuality, and so forth. So men are not all social equals, and likewise, women do not all share a common social status. So there's something very sort of obfuscating about talking about the aim of feminism in this way. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I think, you know, this isn't spelled out like in as much detail in the brief piece that I gave you, but I do think it's, you know, she touches on it there. But it is kind of a central theme of the chapter. And if I can just read you a couple of brief passages from that chapter, if I can find them quickly enough. So for example, so here in her words, women in lower class and poor groups, particularly those who are non-white, would not have defined women's liberation as women gaining social equality with men, since they are continually reminded in their everyday lives that all women do not share a common social status. Concurrently, they know that many males in their social groups are exploited and oppressed. Knowing that men in their groups do not have social, political, and economic power, they would not deem it liberatory to share their social status. And then further down, and for those of you who do end up looking at it, this is on page 18 of chapter 2 of that book. Just further down in that same chapter, these women recognize the possibility that feminism defined as social equality with men might easily become a movement that would primarily affect the social standing of white women in middle and upper class groups, while affecting only in a very marginal way the social status of working class and poor women. So this is a really important point for her because it introduces the idea that in order to address sexist oppression, once you start thinking about the situations of all women and not just some women, it becomes apparent that you need to address various different forms of domination, right? So it kind of opens the door to this much, much broader understanding of what feminism is. This feminism thus defined, she thinks, will only end up, or will mainly end up helping a particular relatively narrow sort of class of women. And that, in her view, is not really what feminism is or ought to be. I want to introduce a concept that is currently kind of gaining a lot of traction, actually in philosophy of race. the concept of political practice. I've been reading, kind of independently of this course, I've been reading this book here. But has anyone heard capture? Is this a term that is AJ?
I've heard of it.
Oh, you've heard of it.
But I would like to generalize it.
Yeah. What was the general idea?
Oh,
It can be rough.
The general idea is that like there's these ideas that come from more radical sort of, sometimes the work with Marxists, critical theorists, sort of places, they work their way up. And then they're sort of taken by elites, people who are in the upper middle to upper class sort of economic status, take remove sort of all the radical bits, achieve the sort of power, try to maintain the power of these theories while also maintaining their own sort of class position.
Good. So actually, it sounds like you're quite familiar with the concept, because that was a really nice summary of how it works. So this is a book by Olufemi Taiwo, and the subtitle is How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics and Everything Else. So that's exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. But although Bell Hooks doesn't use the term elite capture, it really sounds like she's talking about something very similar as it sort of took place within the feminist movement in the United States over several decades. So for example, I actually don't know, I have the wrong page number here. Sorry, that was just a typo, I'll fix that. But she says, feminism in the United States has never emerged from the women who are most victimized by sexist oppression. Why might that be? Well, it's a matter of social power, really. She says, look, what other, this is from the, should be chapter 1. Sorry, there's a few typos in here, I apologize for that. But she's what other group of women, and she's just been talking about white middle class women, in the United States had the same access to universities, publishing houses, mass media, and money, right? So it's a matter of access, of tools, of resources, of having a platform, right? And this kind of distorts the way in which feminism itself is portrayed to the broader public and the way in which it's pursued. And so her point here seems to be, and this comes across, I think, even in the shorter piece, that feminism is produced by relatively elite women tends to serve their interests, interests that at least some of which are shared with men of their class and social status, rather than those of the masses. So this idea is very much present in this piece from Bell Hooks, I think. And when I was reading this book, I'm like, oh, this concept of elite capture, that's like that kind of, no pun intended, captures the idea here in a nice, great, tidy phrase. So yeah, so that's the idea. And I couldn't find an electronic version of this book. This is from 2022, but it is in the library. So Olufemi Taiwo theorizes it, he's working primarily in philosophy of race and kind of a critique of identity politics. But here's the general definition of it that he gives in the first chapter of his book. Elite capture happens when the advantaged few steer resources and institutions that could serve the many towards their own narrower interests and aims. And he's talking about some of the rhetoric of sort of identity politics around race in particular. But again, he actually starts with a discussion of the Combahee River Collective, which was a radical feminist group that kind of coined the term identity politics. So that's sort of the starting point too. And then he looks at how it's drifted from there. But the term itself comes from like development, the discourse around development and international aid, actually. Like it originally is a term that refers to ways in which relatively powerful groups of people in countries that are receiving international aid sometimes manage to kind of capture those resources and deploy them in ways that further their interests rather than benefiting the population at large. So it actually comes out of a different context, right? But it's an extension of that idea that those with relatively more power can capture goods of various sorts and deploy them for their own purposes. There's really a kind of interesting analysis of this in the Tylo book, because he thinks that elites are, in some sense, sort of produced by social systems, and rather than just being like pre-existing actors with nefarious intentions. So there's a whole kind of interesting story about that, but we won't get into that for our purposes. Suffice it to say, he argues that elite capture is symptomatic of societies with unequal access to power. And I mean, here's the move that kind of brings this into relevance. So if we move from, like in the international aid deployment of the term, we're talking about actual goods and funds that are being captured and redeployed. Here, we're clearly talking about something else, right? We're talking about, who has a platform, who gets heard, who people pay attention to, who gets to set the terms of the debate, and so on and so forth. But Tyrell points out that the concept of elite capture applies not only to material wealth and political power, relatively material things that you can imagine being distributed in different ways, but public goods and resources like knowledge, attention, and values, right? So just who gets heard, who's believed, who gets paid attention to, who gets to set the terms of the debate, and so on and so forth. These things can be subject to elite capture as well. So again, and I think bringing this back to this sort of anything goes feminism or choice feminism, I think we could see that arguably as a kind of example of elite capture, where that serves some people's interests much more than it serves others. Does that make sense? Any reactions or comments or questions thus far? I'm only a couple of chapters into the book, but so far it's a really interesting read. All right. So I think we'll have a little bit of time for some more informal discussion again today, actually, which is good. But I want to sort of spend a little bit of time, so we'll see how long this takes, but kind of wrapping up the central themes here. We've touched on, I think, all of these already. But folks, so what is her message here, right? Well, we should move from the idea that, in her view, right, so this is what she's arguing, that we should move from the idea that feminism aims at making women the social equals of men to the alternative formulation that feminism is a movement to end sexist oppression. As we saw before, one thing that she likes about that is that it recenters the debate around sexism rather than portraying men as the enemy. And this is especially important given that she's, very concerned about the ways in which men are not social equals of one another and are also subject to systems of domination. So it's helpful in that way too. It allows us to do justice to that fact. And this means that we will have to examine, once we realize that, women themselves don't all share a common social status or a common experience of oppression. This is going to not just towards examining systems of domination of whatever form, right, wherever they occur, which affect the lives of both men and women, right? So the title of one of her other books, which was kind of focused, I think most of her writing is meant to be accessible, most if not all is meant to be accessible to the public, because she thought that's another form. Maybe that's another way in which theory could be subject to elite capture. But one of her books that's especially publicly oriented is called Feminism is for Everyone, right, which was a central theme in her work. And right, so we should abandon this simplistic stance, examine all systems of domination and our own role in maintaining them, and struggle to end them. And then she lands on this way of formulating the thought. Feminism is the struggle to end sexist oppression. Its aim is not to benefit solely any specific group of women, any particular race or class of women. It does not privilege women over men. It has the power to transform in a meaningful way all our lives. And as a little bit of a preview, I will say we're going to look at some readings that kind of examine, what sexism is and what oppression is, because if we take this definition seriously, then one of the next steps would be to kind of figure out what those are, right? But in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll do, I think, again, what we did last time, just partly to give you a chance to get to know each other a little better. But what do you think of this, right? Your conversation could take various different forms. Do you agree with her critique of equality feminism, of choice feminism? Are hooks and pay being fair to those sort of positions? Is this definition in itself satisfactory? Do you see any problems with this? Just take a few minutes to discuss this amongst yourselves, and I'll let you know when it's 11:30 and we can wrap up for the day. So just, again, I haven't formulated specific discussion groups yet, so you can just cluster with the people who are near you, like maybe 3 or 4 people.
Did you want I'm Jordan.
No, like my bad. Like my bad.
Yeah,
I think it makes sense. I'll come in with you.
I like it
That makes sense.
because I'm not trying to be your social equal. I want to be able to consistently with you and not hear, well, she's a mother before she works, or yeah, she can be dedicated to herself to what she doesn't. Like there's certain things that women can do that men can't, but all of a sudden it becomes a disqualification for your ability to be professional, your ability to dedicate yourself, so that you're seen as less than. So I think that saying we're in social equal is what we are. Like we're just not, we play different roles in other areas. But more so saying that we're trying to fight sexism is better because it's going on.
No,
It's how we're harming ourselves too. And so if we fight those sexist ideologies that we experience in workforces, day-to-day life, it's going to help us reconstruct our society and future a lot more inclusive.
I'm like exactly on the same page as you. I think that I like how she frames it as sexist oppression. Like you said, it goes both ways. And I also think that like men and women have very different roles. But also at the same time we're not put into, I don't like putting us all into the same categories because people vary. But I think I like the emphasis on just sexist oppression.
Instead of it being like centered on
No, instead of it being centered on
but instead of it like only being like a women's problem, we're talking about it's an umbrella term of all species. It's kind of like what you're saying. Like you like that it's not just it's like everyone is, there's consequence for everybody.
Exactly, like, and different sepsis, like, in a way,
so oppressed and like they kind of like their femininity or ability to be seen as something that's kind of and so there's even that like fight to be seen as women. At the same time, as like more privileged women wanting to like work in so I think centering on sorts of sexist oppression and what I think of I think the last part I like there's just more nuance. Like I think it's just kind of fabulous. I think very kind of focused on legal like this kind of thing. We have the right to do this thing rather than like social structures and like we're socialized or in certain systems that you know
but I think especially nowadays, it's very white
And I like
and then, but there's still something about this definition of sexism. I can't pinpoint it, but like I don't.
Is the struggle. I think the word struggle, like, it's not, it makes it sound like it's something that has been tried and failed.
Yeah, like unachievable.
Yeah.
It feels like you won't attain this. It's a concept, not an action. We need to address the need for new including the people that's absolutely necessary. And if you're not willing to include people in the conversation, then you're not going to get it. You can't have 100 seats at a table and only let one person show up. You have to let everybody in. It's like they weren't even fighting for the right to vote. They tried to get women by other women. It's their fight against the feminist was acknowledge that woman. So I think they're going to start acknowledging consistent. And we don't need to just say
I would say
that's not what that is. Like I would
I was talking about how I feel like it's not just like oppression,
I don't know, it was probably worded by trying to make it like better way to say
The other sexism
or maybe like trying to compare it to one we're battling you know sexism for every we need to address sexism on all sides of the spectrum.
I don't know, it's just kind of
You can listen to people but actually
I think this also brings up an interesting question. Can I feel like that's the first thing that like obviously I think in person first.
Yeah.
Yes. But I think it's an institution. That's also why I think it still feels like it's centering men. That's
labels on the very real
like centralized on like that you would say are they like or are they like and then it's I don't know like are because now where they have their own like their own manhood you know in a lot of times I feel like I think they go on suffocated so that's an interesting of like define whatever oppression whereas like
you know, like, yeah, I know,
yes, they can be harmful sexism, but maybe not make them just sexist oppression. sense. It's not as like, it's still the result of like institutions, but it's not institutionalized in harm. You just are more like damage from the effects of the implications of it. So that's the damage of harm and whatever
Alright, folks, it's 11:30, so you're free to come to your next classes or whatever you have on your agenda. So I'll see you next week, and let me know if we have any questions. Oh, and you have it signed for make sure you say.
Yeah.